In a world where respect is earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice, sometimes the most powerful lesson comes from the most unexpected source. What happens when someone makes fun of a person's rank, only to discover they've just insulted one of the most decorated warriors in military history? This is the true story of Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, a Navy SEAL whose quiet presence commanded more respect than any uniform could ever display. It's about the day 4 generals stopped everything they were doing to show honor where honor was due, and how one moment of ignorance became a lesson in humility that no one in that room would ever forget. Some heroes wear their achievements on their chest, others carry them in their hearts, waiting for the right moment to remind the world what true courage looks like. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pentagon's corridors as Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen walked purposefully toward Conference Room 2B. Her dress blue uniform was immaculate, every crease sharp, every ribbon perfectly aligned. At 5'14" tall, with an unassuming presence, she moved through the bustling hallway like a ghost among giants. Most people barely noticed her, and that was exactly how she preferred it. Sarah had been summoned to this high-level briefing on counter-terrorism strategies in Southeast Asia. As one of the few Navy SEALs with extensive experience in that region, her insights were considered invaluable by Pentagon brass. But as she approached the conference room, she could hear voices already engaged in heated discussion. The room was filled with military officials of various ranks, defense contractors, and policymakers. At the head of the table sat General Marcus Rodriguez, a man whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by his intolerance for incompetence. To his right was General Patricia Walsh, the first woman to hold her position in the Joint Chiefs. General David Kim occupied the seat across from her, while General Robert Hayes completed the circle of 4-star officers present. As Sarah entered quietly and took a seat near the back of the room, she noticed the tension was already thick. The discussion centered around recent intelligence failures in the Pacific Theater, and fingers were being pointed in multiple directions. Defense contractor representatives were making excuses, junior officers were being blamed, and the atmosphere was growing more hostile by the minute. "The problem with this operation," declared a loud voice from the middle of the room, "is that we keep sending the wrong people for these missions." The speaker was Thomas Brennan, a senior defense contractor known for his political connections and his equally well-known lack of actual combat experience. His expensive suit and confident demeanor masked an arrogance that many in the room found insufferable. Brennan had built his career on government contracts and political favors rather than military service. He had never worn a uniform, never faced enemy fire, and never had to make life or death decisions in the field. Yet here he was, in a room full of decorated military officers, acting as if he understood warfare better than those who had actually lived it.
"We need people with real experience," Brennan continued, his voice carrying across the room.
Not some junior officers who think they know what they're doing because they've watched a few action movies. Several junior officers in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly feeling the weight of his criticism. Sarah remained silent, studying the briefing documents in front of her. She had learned long ago that in rooms like this, it was better to listen first and speak when your words would have the most impact. Her philosophy had always been to let her actions speak louder than her voice, and it had served her well throughout her career. The briefing continued with various officials presenting their analyses of recent operations. Charts and graphs filled the large screens at the front of the room, showing success rates, casualty figures, and resource allocation. As each presenter spoke, Brennan made increasingly pointed comments about the military's failures and the need for better leadership. "What we need," Brennan announced during a brief pause in the presentations, "is to stop relying on these so-called elite units. Half of them are just glorified Boy Scouts with fancy training. The real decisions should be left to people who understand strategy, not these wannabe heroes who think they're invincible." General Rodriguez frowned at this comment, but before he could respond, Brennan's attention was drawn to something else. He had noticed Sarah sitting quietly in the back corner, taking notes. Her lieutenant commander rank was clearly visible on her uniform, and to someone like Brennan, who judged people purely by appearances and rank structure, she seemed like an easy target. "Take her, for example," Brennan said, gesturing dismissively towards Sarah. "A lieutenant commander. Probably spent her whole career behind a desk pushing papers and thinks she understands combat operations. This is exactly the kind of person who shouldn't be making decisions about real military strategy." The room fell silent. Every eye turned towards Sarah, who looked up from her notes with a calm expression that revealed nothing of what she was thinking. The 4 generals at the head of the table exchanged quick glances, their faces showing a mixture of disbelief and barely contained anger. Sarah had been in situations like this before, though usually they involved enemy combatants rather than ignorant civilians. She had learned to control her emotions under pressure, to think clearly when others were losing their minds, and to respond with precision rather than passion. These skills had kept her alive in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, and they served her well now. "I'm sorry," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent room. "Could you repeat that? I want to make sure I understand your position correctly." Brennan, emboldened by what he mistook for uncertainty, leaned back in his chair with a smug expression. "I said that junior officers like yourself shouldn't be involved in strategic planning. You probably don't have the experience or the perspective necessary to understand the complexities of modern warfare. No offense, but rank is rank for a reason." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. General Rodriguez's jaw tightened visibly, while General Walsh's eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. General Kim's hands clenched into fists on the table, and General Hayes looked like he was calculating exactly how long it would take to have Brennan removed from the building. Sarah nodded slowly, as if she was seriously considering his words.
"I see. So in your opinion, experience in combat operations isn't as important as what exactly?"
Political connections? Contract negotiations? The ability to criticize others from the safety of an office? "Experience matters," Brennan replied, missing the warning signs completely, "but real experience. Not whatever basic training exercises you might have completed. I'm talking about understanding the bigger picture, the strategic implications, the political ramifications, things that require serious education and real-world business experience." "Interesting perspective," Sarah said, her voice remaining perfectly calm. "And you based this assessment on what, exactly? My appearance? My rank? The fact that I haven't interrupted anyone or tried to dominate the conversation?" Around the room, military officers were beginning to realize what was happening. Some had heard stories about Lieutenant Commander Chen, though few had met her in person. Others were simply recognizing the signs of someone who was about to teach a very painful lesson in humility. Brennan, however, was completely oblivious to the danger he was walking into. "Look, nothing personal, but this is a room full of serious people making serious decisions. Maybe you'd be more comfortable in whatever administrative role you usually fill. Leave the real military planning to the people who actually understand it." General Rodriguez started to stand up, his face flushed with anger, but Sarah caught his eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. She had dealt with worse insults from better men, and she wasn't about to let someone like Brennan provoke her into losing her composure. "You're absolutely right," Sarah said, surprising everyone in the room. "Experience is everything, and education is important too. So let me ask you something, Mr. Brennan. In your experience, what's the most effective way to clear a building full of hostiles without causing civilian casualties?" Brennan blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in the conversation. "Well, that's a tactical question. That's exactly the kind of detailed stuff that should be left to the people in the field. I deal with bigger picture issues." "I see. So you don't have experience with tactical operations?" "That's fine. What about strategic planning for unconventional warfare? How would you recommend dealing with an enemy that doesn't wear uniforms and blends in with the local population?" That's why we have intelligence agencies," Brennan stammered, beginning to sense that he might be in over his head. "And specialized units. People who are trained for that kind of thing." "Specialized units," Sarah repeated thoughtfully. "Like Navy SEALs, for instance?"
Well, yes, I suppose.
"If they're properly led and have the right support structure. But that's my point. It takes more than just some special training to understand how these units should be deployed and managed." Sarah nodded again, her expression remaining neutral. "You're absolutely right. It takes real experience, combat experience. The kind of experience you only get by actually being there, making life and death decisions and living with the consequences." The room was now completely silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning system. Even the junior officers who didn't know who Sarah was could sense that something significant was about to happen. "Mr. Brennan," Sarah continued, her voice still perfectly calm, "I appreciate your concern about my qualifications, and you're right that rank alone doesn't tell the whole story. So perhaps you'd like to know a bit more about my background before we continue this discussion." Brennan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, finally beginning to realize that he might have made a mistake. I wasn't trying to. Oh, please don't apologize," Sarah said with what might have been the ghost of a smile. "I think it's important that everyone in this room understands exactly who they're dealing with. After all, as you said, experience is everything."
Sarah Chen stood up slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled.
Every person in the room watched as she walked toward the front, her footsteps echoing softly on the polished floor. The four generals remained seated, But their posture had shifted. They were no longer just observing, they were witnessing something that none of them would ever forget. Since Mr. Pyre, Brennan has raised questions about qualifications and experience, Sarah began, her voice carrying easily through the silent room. I think it might be helpful to establish some context for our discussion today. She turned to face the room, her hands clasped behind her back in a stance that any military officer would recognize as parade rest. My name is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, United States Navy. I graduated from the Naval Academy in 2008 and immediately volunteered for basic underwater demolition/SEAL training. I was part of the first class to include women in the full SEAL pipeline, though I should mention that gender was never really the issue. The issue was whether I could meet the same standards that have been applied to every SEAL candidate for decades. Brennan's face had gone pale, but Sarah wasn't finished. Not even close. I completed BUD/S with Class 301, finishing in the top 10% of my class. After completing SEAL qualification training and receiving my Trident, I was assigned to SEAL Team 3, based out of Coronado. My first deployment was to Afghanistan in 2011, where I served as an assault team member in Helmand Province. Around the room, military officers were beginning to sit straighter in their chairs. Several junior officers who had seemed intimidated by Brennan's earlier comments were now watching Sarah with something approaching awe. During that first deployment, Sarah continued, her voice never wavering, my team conducted 47 direct action missions, including the rescue of 2 captured aid workers and the elimination of a high-value target who had been responsible for coordinating IED attacks against coalition forces. I received my first Bronze Star for actions during a mission where our team was pinned down by enemy fire for 6 hours while protecting a convoy of wounded soldiers. General Rodriguez was now watching Brennan with unconcealed contempt, while the other generals maintained their professional composure with visible effort. They all knew Sarah's record, at least the parts that weren't classified, and they were enjoying watching this particular lesson unfold. My second deployment was to Iraq in 2012, Sarah continued. By this time, I had been promoted to lieutenant and was serving as a team leader. We conducted operations throughout the Sunni Triangle, working primarily on counterterrorism missions against what would eventually become ISIS. During one particular mission in Ramadi, my team was tasked with capturing a bomb maker who had been targeting Iraqi police stations. Sarah paused for a moment, and for the first time, those watching her could see something flicker across her face. Not fear or hesitation, but the weight of memories that most people in the room could never fully understand. The intelligence was wrong, she said simply. Instead of finding one bomb maker in a small safe house, we walked into a complex that housed 12 armed insurgents and enough explosives to level a city block. The building was booby-trapped, our extraction route was compromised, and we had civilians in the area that we couldn't leave behind. The room was so quiet that the sound of papers rustling would have seemed like thunder. Brennan had stopped moving entirely, frozen in his chair, as the reality of his mistake began to sink in. My team spent 4 hours in that building, Sarah continued. We had to fight our way through 3 floors of armed resistance while simultaneously defusing multiple IEDs and evacuating 7 civilian hostages. During the operation, I took shrapnel in my left shoulder and continued fighting. When our communications were jammed and we couldn't call for backup, I made the decision to split our team. I led 3 SEALs and the hostages through a tunnel system that we discovered in the basement, while my second-in-command led the rest of the team through the main route. General Walsh was now leaning forward in her chair, completely absorbed in Sarah's account. She had read the after-action reports from this mission, but hearing it firsthand was something entirely different. We all made it out, Sarah said. All 7 hostages survived. All 12 insurgents were either killed or captured, along with enough intelligence to roll up their entire network in that sector. The explosives we recovered prevented at least 6 planned attacks on civilian targets. For my actions during that mission, I received the Silver Star. Brennan looked like he was having trouble breathing. Several other contractors in the room were studying their paperwork with sudden intensity, clearly hoping to avoid drawing any attention to themselves. After Iraq, I was selected for advanced training at the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Sarah continued. I spent 2 years at Dam Neck, learning advanced tactics, techniques, and procedures for special operations missions. During this time, I also completed degrees in international relations and strategic studies, graduating summa cum laude from both programs. The mention of DEEWGR GRU sent a ripple through the room. Even civilians who didn't understand military structure knew what that meant. SEAL Team 6, the most elite of the elite, In 2015, I was deployed to Syria as part of a joint task force working against ISIS leadership. The details of most of these missions remain classified, but I can tell you that my team was responsible for the capture or elimination of 17 high-value targets over a period of 8 months. These included bomb makers, recruiters, financial coordinators, and operational planners. Sarah walked back toward her seat, but remained standing.
During one mission near Aleppo, my team was tasked with rescuing a captured journalist who was being held by an ISIS cell. The intelligence indicated that she was being moved every few days, and we had a very narrow window to act.
The mission required infiltrating a compound in the middle of a city controlled by hostile forces, locating and extracting the hostage, and getting out without triggering a response that would endanger other hostages being held in the area. Every person in the room was hanging on her words now. Even the generals who had access to classified briefings and knew more about special operations than most people could imagine were captivated by Sarah's calm, professional recounting of events that sounded like something from a movie. The compound was heavily fortified, with multiple layers of security and at least 30 armed guards, Sarah continued. My team of 8 SEALs had to penetrate the perimeter, neutralize the guards without raising an alarm, locate the hostage among dozens of rooms and possible hiding places, and extract her while fighting our way out through enemy territory. Sarah paused again, and this time her expression showed something that might have been pride. Not arrogance or boastfulness, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who had faced an impossible situation and found a way to succeed. The mission took place over 2 nights. On the first night, we conducted surveillance and identified the hostage's location. On the second night, we executed the rescue. The operation lasted 4 hours from insertion to extraction. We recovered the journalist, eliminated 12 enemy combatants, and captured enough intelligence to prevent 3 planned attacks on civilian targets in Europe. Every member of my team made it home safely. General Kim was now openly smiling, despite the serious nature of the briefing. He had been there when Sarah received her 2nd Silver Star for this mission, and he remembered the quiet dignity with which she had accepted the honor. For my actions in Syria, Sarah said, I received my 2nd Silver Star, along with promotion to Lieutenant Commander. I also received commendations from the governments of 3 allied nations, whose citizens we were able to protect as a result of the intelligence gathered during these operations. Brennan was now staring at his hands. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. Several people in the room were looking at him with expressions ranging from pity to disgust. Since returning from Syria in 2016, Sarah continued, I have served as an instructor at the Naval Special Warfare Center, where I have trained over 200 SEAL candidates in advanced tactics and leadership. I have also served as a consultant to the Joint Chiefs of Staff on counterterrorism strategy, and I have briefed the Secretary of Defense on 17 separate occasions regarding special operations in the Pacific Theater. Sarah finally sat back down, folding her hands on the table in front of her. So, Mr. Brennan, to answer your earlier question about my qualifications, I have spent the last 15 years of my life serving my country in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. I have led men and women in combat, made life and death decisions under pressure that most people cannot imagine, and taken responsibility for the lives of my teammates, our allies, and innocent civilians caught in the crossfire of conflicts they never chose to be part of. The silence in the room was now complete and absolute. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to be breathing. I have been shot at, bombed, and threatened by some of the most dangerous people in the world, Sarah continued, her voice still calm and professional. I have also had the honor of serving alongside some of the bravest, most dedicated people I have ever known. People who have sacrificed everything, including their lives, to protect the freedoms that allow civilians like yourself to sit in rooms like this and criticize the very people who ensure your safety. Brennan looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Around the room, other defense contractors were suddenly finding their shoes fascinating, while military officers were looking at Sarah with expressions of respect and admiration. Now, Sarah said, turning her attention back to the briefing materials on the table, I believe we were discussing counter-terrorism strategies in Southeast Asia. I have some insights from my recent deployment to that region that might be relevant to our discussion, unless, of course, Mr. Edge, Brennan has any other concerns about my qualifications that we should address first. The moment Sarah finished speaking, something extraordinary happened. General Marcus Rodriguez, a man who had commanded respect from world leaders and had never been seen to show deference to anyone of lower rank in front of civilians, slowly rose from his seat. His movement was deliberate, formal, and unmistakably ceremonial. The room watched in stunned silence as the 4-star general came to attention, his posture perfect, his eyes fixed on Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen. Then, in a gesture that would be talked about in Pentagon corridors for years to come, General Rodriguez rendered a slow, respectful military salute. The effect was immediate and electric. Before anyone could process what they had just witnessed, General Patricia Walsh rose from her chair with equal formality. Her salute was crisp, professional, and held for exactly the prescribed duration. She was followed by General David Kim, whose typically stoic expression had been replaced by one of unmistakable respect and admiration. Finally, General Robert Hayes stood and saluted, completing what would go down as one of the most significant moments of military courtesy ever displayed in a Pentagon briefing room. Sarah, recognizing the unprecedented honor being shown to her, rose smoothly from her chair and returned the salute with the same precision and dignity that she had brought to every mission, every operation, and every moment of her military career. The exchange lasted only seconds, but everyone present understood that they had just witnessed something that would define the standard for military respect and recognition for generations to come. As the generals resumed their seats, the atmosphere in the room had changed completely. What had begun as a routine briefing punctuated by one man's arrogant ignorance had transformed into a profound demonstration of what true military leadership and sacrifice actually meant. Brennan sat frozen in his chair, his face alternating between pale shock and deep red embarrassment. He had insulted a war hero, questioned the qualifications of someone who had risked her life dozens of times for her country, and done it all in front of the most senior military leadership in the nation. The magnitude of his mistake was only beginning to sink in. Lieutenant Commander Chen, General Rodriguez said, his voice carrying new warmth and respect. Please continue with your assessment of the Southeast Asia situation. I believe your insights will be invaluable to our discussion. Sarah nodded and moved to the front of the room, where a large digital display showed a map of the Pacific region. As she began to outline the tactical and strategic challenges facing American forces in the area, it became clear that her expertise went far beyond her combat experience. The primary challenge we face in this region, Sarah began, is not just the conventional military capabilities of potential adversaries, but the complex web of relationships between state and non-state actors. During my recent deployment to the Philippines, I observed firsthand how terrorist organizations are adapting their tactics to exploit both technological advances and local political instabilities. She used a laser pointer to highlight specific areas on the map. Here in the Southern Islands, we're seeing increased cooperation between traditional separatist groups and international terrorist networks. They're sharing resources, training methods, and most importantly, intelligence-gathering techniques that are far more sophisticated than what we encountered even 5 years ago. General Walsh leaned forward with interest. What specific adaptations have you observed, Commander? The most significant change is their use of social media and electronic communications, Sarah replied. They've learned from the mistakes made by ISIS leadership in Syria and Iraq. Instead of relying on easily intercepted communications, they're using commercial gaming platforms, encrypted messaging apps, and even online gaming environments to coordinate operations. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a complex network diagram. During Operation Seahawk last year, my team infiltrated a terrorist cell that was using a popular online role-playing game to plan real-world attacks. They had created an entire virtual organization within the game, using fantasy terminology and scenarios to discuss actual operational plans. General Kim whistled softly. How did you uncover this? It was actually discovered by accident, Sarah admitted. One of our local assets mentioned that his teenage son had been recruited to play this game by someone claiming to be from their local mosque. The son noticed that the game missions he was being asked to plan seemed remarkably similar to the layout of actual government buildings in their city. Around the room, military and civilian officials were taking notes rapidly. This was exactly the kind of ground-level intelligence that no amount of satellite surveillance or signals intelligence could provide. The tactical implications are significant, Sarah continued. These groups are recruiting young people who have grown up with sophisticated gaming and technology skills. They're not just looking for people willing to carry out attacks. They're looking for people who can help them develop new methods of communication, surveillance, and operational planning. She moved to another slide, showing photographs of captured equipment. This brings me to the second major challenge, technological adaptation. During our operations in the region, we've recovered improvised explosive devices that incorporate commercial drone technology, modified gaming controllers for remote detonation, and communication systems built from off-the-shelf electronics that would have required specialized military equipment just a few years ago. General Hayes frowned at the implications. Are you saying that terrorist organizations now have access to the same technological capabilities as our special operations units?
In some cases, yes, Sarah replied frankly.
And in some cases, they're actually ahead of us. They're not constrained by military procurement processes, congressional oversight, or safety regulations. If they want to modify a commercial drone to carry explosives, they can do it in a garage workshop in a matter of days. If we want to develop countermeasures, it takes months or years of testing, approval, and deployment. She clicked to a photograph showing what appeared to be an ordinary commercial quadcopter drone. This device was recovered from a terrorist safe house in Mindanao. It looks like a standard recreational drone that you could buy at any electronics store. However, our technical analysis revealed that it had been modified to carry a 3-pound explosive payload, equipped with facial recognition software, and programmed to target individuals wearing specific types of uniforms. The room erupted in quiet murmurs as the implications sank in. Brennan, meanwhile, continued to sit in mortified silence, clearly understanding that his earlier comments about Sarah's qualifications had revealed his complete ignorance of the realities facing modern military operations.
The third challenge, Sarah continued, is the human intelligence aspect.
Traditional HUMINT collection in this region has relied heavily on local assets who understood the cultural, linguistic, and religious dynamics of their communities. However, we're now seeing terrorist organizations specifically targeting these traditional networks. She displayed a chart showing casualty figures for local informants and allies. In the past 18 months, we've lost contact with 63% of our established human intelligence sources in the southern Philippines. This isn't just due to operational security failures, it's the result of a systematic campaign to identify and eliminate anyone who might be cooperating with American or allied forces. General Rodriguez studied the chart grimly. What's your assessment of how they're identifying our sources? They're using social media analysis, financial tracking, and behavioral pattern recognition, Sarah replied. During one operation, we discovered that they had compiled detailed dossiers on over 400 local residents, including their family connections, financial situations, travel patterns, and social media activity. They were using this information to identify people who might be susceptible to recruitment by American forces. She paused to let this sink in before continuing. They had also identified people whose behavior patterns had changed in ways that might suggest they were already cooperating with us. Changes in spending habits, travel routines, or communication patterns that could indicate they were receiving payment or instructions from outside sources. The sophistication of these methods was clearly impressing even the most senior officials in the room. General Walsh shook her head in amazement. This level of analysis requires significant resources and expertise. Are they getting outside assistance? That's where the fourth challenge comes in, Sarah said, advancing to her next slide. We're seeing increasing evidence of cooperation between regional terrorist groups and organized crime syndicates. Drug trafficking organizations, human trafficking networks, and arms dealers are providing technical expertise, financial resources, and operational support to terrorist cells. The slide showed a complex organizational chart connecting various criminal and terrorist groups across Southeast Asia. These relationships are mutually beneficial. Criminal organizations get protection and assistance with their illegal activities, while terrorist groups get access to smuggling routes, money laundering capabilities, and technical expertise. She pointed to specific connections on the chart. For example, we've documented cases where drug trafficking organizations have provided terrorist groups with encrypted communication equipment originally designed for coordinating drug shipments. In return, the terrorist groups have provided security for drug manufacturing facilities and smuggling operations.
General Kim leaned back in his chair, clearly troubled by these revelations.
So we're not just fighting terrorism anymore, we're fighting an integrated network of criminal and terrorist organizations that are sharing resources and expertise. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. And this brings me to my final point about the challenges we face in this region. Traditional counterterrorism approaches that focus solely on military action are no longer sufficient. We need a comprehensive approach that addresses the criminal networks, the technological capabilities, the human intelligence challenges, and the underlying social and economic conditions that make these partnerships possible. She clicked to her final slide, which outlined a multifaceted strategic approach. Based on my experience in the region, I recommend a strategy that combines targeted military action with enhanced cyber capabilities, improved human intelligence collection, strengthened partnerships with allied nations, and increased focus on disrupting the financial networks that support these organizations. Around the room, officials were nodding in agreement, clearly impressed by the depth and sophistication of Sarah's analysis. Her recommendations were based not on theoretical knowledge or policy papers, but on direct experience in the field, face-to-face encounters with the enemy, and first-hand observation of their capabilities and tactics. The most important element of this strategy, Sarah concluded, is understanding that we're not fighting the same enemy we faced 10 or even 5 years ago. These organizations are adaptive, sophisticated, and increasingly well-resourced. If we want to succeed against them, we need to be even more adaptive, more sophisticated, and more strategic in our approach. As Sarah returned to her seat, the room erupted in questions from military officials eager to learn more about her observations and recommendations. Brennan, meanwhile, had become increasingly smaller in his chair, clearly realizing that he had not only insulted a war hero, but had done so while demonstrating his own complete ignorance of the very issues he claimed to understand. The questions came rapidly from every corner of the room. General Walsh wanted to know about specific tactical recommendations for dealing with the drone threat. General Kim was interested in the intelligence sharing protocols that Sarah had developed with Allied forces in the Philippines. General Hayes asked for detailed assessments of the training programs needed to prepare American forces for these new types of threats. Sarah answered each question with the same calm professionalism she had displayed throughout her presentation. Her responses were detailed, practical, and clearly based on extensive real-world experience. It became increasingly obvious to everyone present that they were listening to someone who didn't just understand counterterrorism strategy in theory, but had lived it, breathed it, and perfected it through years of dangerous, high-stakes operations.
Commander Chen, said Colonel Martinez, one of the junior officers who had been targets of Brennan's earlier criticism. In your experience, what's the most critical skill set that our current training programs are lacking? Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. Adaptability, she said simply. We're very good at training people to execute specific procedures and follow established protocols. But in the field, especially when dealing with these hybrid criminal terrorist networks, success often depends on the ability to recognize when the situation has changed and adapt your approach accordingly. She stood again and walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room. Let me give you an example from my last deployment. We had received intelligence about a bomb-making facility located in what our sources described as an abandoned warehouse in a rural area outside of Zamboanga City. Standard operating procedure would have been to conduct surveillance, plan an assault, and execute a direct action mission. Sarah drew a simple diagram on the whiteboard showing what their intelligence had suggested they would find. However, when we arrived and began our reconnaissance, we discovered that the abandoned warehouse was actually a functioning shipping facility that was being used for legitimate business during the day and terrorist activities at night. She modified the diagram to show a more complex situation. We also discovered that the facility was located in the middle of a residential neighborhood, not in a rural area as we had been told. There were families living within 50 meters of the target building, including small children who played in the area during the day. Around the room, military officers were nodding in recognition. Every combat veteran had stories of intelligence that turned out to be wrong or incomplete, situations where the real world didn't match what they had been told to expect. At this point, Sarah continued, we had several options. We could abort the mission and wait for better intelligence. We could proceed with the original plan and accept the risk of civilian casualties. Or we could adapt our approach to deal with the actual situation instead of the situation we had been told to expect. General Rodriguez leaned forward with interest. What did you decide? We spent 3 days developing a completely new plan, Sarah replied. Instead of a direct assault, we infiltrated the facility during daytime business hours. 2 members of my team posed as shipping company inspectors, while the rest of us established overwatch positions in nearby buildings. She drew additional elements on her diagram. We discovered that the terrorist cell was using the legitimate shipping business as cover for moving explosive materials and weapons. They had modified one of the storage areas to serve as a bomb-making workshop, but they only worked at night when the legitimate business was closed. Sarah turned back to face the room. Rather than conduct a military raid that would have endangered civilians and potentially destroyed evidence, we chose to gather intelligence and coordinate with local law enforcement. We spent 6 days documenting the terrorist activities, identifying all the members of the cell and mapping their network of contacts and suppliers. General Walsh smiled approvingly. And the results? We rolled up the entire network, Sarah replied with quiet satisfaction. 12 arrests, including the bomb maker, and 2 financial coordinators. We recovered enough explosive materials to prevent at least 15 planned attacks. Most importantly, we did it without firing a single shot or endangering any civilians. She paused before adding, the legitimate shipping business continued operating, providing jobs for 37 local families who had no idea they were working next to a terrorist bomb-making facility. Colonel Martinez was taking detailed notes.
So the key was recognizing that the real situation was different from what you had been told to expect. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. And being willing to completely change your approach when the facts on the ground don't match your assumptions. That kind of adaptability can't be taught through classroom instruction or simulation exercises. It has to be developed through experience, and it requires the confidence to make difficult decisions under pressure.
General Kim nodded thoughtfully. This is exactly the kind of insight we need to incorporate into our training programs and operational planning. Commander, would you be willing to work with us to develop new protocols based on these experiences?
Absolutely, sir, Sarah replied.
I think it's critical that we learn from these operations and share that knowledge with the next generation of military leaders. As the discussion continued, Brennan remained conspicuously silent. Several times, other civilians in the room had tried to include him in the conversation, but he had responded with only brief nods or one-word answers. The confidence and arrogance he had displayed earlier had been completely replaced by obvious embarrassment and discomfort. Finally, as the briefing began to wind down, General Rodriguez addressed the elephant in the room.
Mr. Brennan, he said, his voice carrying just a hint of steel, I believe you had some concerns earlier about military qualifications and experience.
Do you have any questions for Commander Chen based on what you've heard today? All eyes turned to Brennan, who looked like he would rather be anywhere else in the world. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat before finally speaking. I think it's clear that I was mistaken in my earlier comments.
Commander Chen obviously has far more experience and expertise than I initially realized.
Sarah looked at him with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the entire encounter.
Brennan, I appreciate your acknowledgement, but I want you to understand something important.
I'm not offended by your initial comments about my qualifications. What concerns me is the attitude behind those comments. She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. Military rank, gender, age, or appearance don't tell you everything you need to know about someone's capabilities or contributions.
Some of the bravest, most skilled people I've served with don't look like what civilians might expect a warrior to look like. Brennan nodded, clearly uncomfortable but listening intently.
Then, more importantly, Sarah continued, the people in this room and thousands of others like them have dedicated their lives to protecting the freedoms that allow all of us to sit here safely and debate policy. That dedication and sacrifice deserves respect, regardless of rank or position. She gestured toward the junior officers who had been targets of Brennan's earlier criticism. These men and women have volunteered to put themselves in harm's way for their country. They've undergone extensive training, demonstrated their competence under pressure, and earned their positions through merit and dedication. Dismissing their contributions based on their rank or appearance does a disservice to them and to the entire military profession. General Walsh spoke up, her voice carrying clear authority. Commander Chen is absolutely right. Mr. Brennan, I want to make something very clear. The people in this room, regardless of their rank, are here because they have expertise and insights that are valuable to our national security. Questioning their qualifications based on superficial characteristics is not acceptable. She fixed Brennan with a steady stare. Furthermore, the kind of dismissive attitude you displayed earlier is exactly the type of thinking that leads to intelligence failures and operational mistakes. If you can't recognize expertise when it's sitting right in front of you, how can we trust your judgment about complex military and security issues? Brennan's face had gone pale again.
General Walsh, I sincerely apologize.
I clearly misjudged the situation and spoke out of turn. It won't happen again. General Rodriguez stood up, signaling that the briefing was coming to an end. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been one of the most valuable briefings I've attended in years. Commander Chen, your insights into the evolving threat landscape in Southeast Asia will be instrumental in shaping our strategy going forward. He turned to address the entire room. I want everyone here to take note of what we've learned today. Not just about the tactical and strategic challenges we face, but about the importance of recognizing and respecting expertise wherever we find it. As people began gathering their materials and preparing to leave, several junior officers approached Sarah to thank her for the way she had handled the situation. Colonel Martinez spoke for many of them when he said, "Ma'am, thank you for standing up for all of us. And thank you for showing us what real leadership looks like." Sarah smiled genuinely for the first time since entering the room. "Colonel, you don't need to thank me for doing my job. But I do want you to remember something. The respect you show to others, especially those who serve under you or alongside you, defines the kind of leader you'll become.
Never let anyone convince you that rank or position is more important than character and competence. As the room emptied, Brennan lingered near the door, clearly wanting to say something more, but uncertain how to approach Sarah. Finally, he walked over to where she was packing up her briefing materials.
Commander Chen, he began hesitantly, I owe you a personal apology. What I said earlier was inexcusable, and it was based on ignorance and prejudice that I'm ashamed to admit. Sarah looked up from her papers and studied his face for a moment. Mr. Brennan, I accept your apology. But more importantly, I hope you'll learn from this experience. She stood and faced him directly.
The next time you're in a room full of military professionals, I hope you'll remember that every person in uniform has a story, has made sacrifices, and has earned the right to be treated with respect. You don't have to agree with their opinions or recommendations, but you should respect their service and their expertise.
Brennan nodded earnestly. I will, Commander. I promise you that.
As Sarah walked toward the door, she was stopped by General Rodriguez.
Commander, that was masterfully handled. You turned what could have been a very unpleasant confrontation into a teaching moment for everyone in the room.
Thank you, sir, Sarah replied. But, honestly, I think Mr. B. Brennan learned more than anyone else today. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from our mistakes.
General Rodriguez smiled.
Indeed they do. And sometimes the best teachers are the people we least expect.
6 months later, Thomas Brennan sat in his office overlooking downtown Washington, staring at a framed photograph on his desk. It wasn't a picture of his family or his latest corporate achievement.
Instead, it was a photograph from a military memorial service he had attended 3 weeks earlier, showing rows of American flags planted in honor of fallen service members. The events of that day in Conference Room 2B had changed him in ways he was still discovering. What had begun as the most humiliating experience of his professional life had evolved into something much deeper and more meaningful. The woman who had so thoroughly demolished his arrogance had also, inadvertently, given him a new perspective on service, sacrifice, and the true meaning of leadership. Brennan had spent the months following the briefing educating himself about military service and the experiences of veterans. He had read books, attended lectures, and most importantly, he had listened. He had learned about the challenges facing returning veterans, the gaps in support services, and the disconnect between military and civilian communities. His company, which had previously focused solely on maximizing profits from defense contracts, had quietly begun implementing a comprehensive veterans hiring program. They had also established partnerships with organizations providing support services for military families and veterans transitioning to civilian careers. But perhaps the most significant change had been personal. Brennan had begun volunteering at a local veteran center, helping former military personnel navigate the often confusing process of applying for benefits and finding employment. It was humbling work that had taught him more about courage and resilience than any boardroom negotiation ever could.
The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now spending his free time helping people whose service he had once dismissed and whose expertise he had questioned. Every veteran he met had a story, and those stories had gradually opened his eyes to a world of sacrifice and dedication that he had never understood.
Today was different, though. Today, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen was visiting his office. When his secretary announced her arrival, Brennan felt the familiar flutter of nervousness that had become associated with their name, not because he was afraid of her, but because he still felt the weight of his initial misjudgment and wanted to prove that he had learned from his mistakes. Sarah entered his office wearing her dress blue uniform, looking exactly as composed and professional as she had that day in the Pentagon. But there was something different in her expression when she looked at him, a warmth that hadn't been there during their first encounter.
Mr. Brennan, she said with a slight smile, thank you for agreeing to meet with me.
Commander Chen, he replied, standing to shake her hand. The pleasure is entirely mine. Please, have a seat.
Can I offer you coffee or anything else?
Coffee would be great, thank you. As Brennan poured coffee from the pot his secretary had prepared, Sarah looked around his office. Her eyes lingered on the memorial photograph, and she noticed several new additions to his bookshelf. Volumes on military history, veteran affairs, and leadership philosophy.
I have to admit, Brennan said as he handed her a cup, I was surprised when you called. I wasn't sure you'd ever want to see me again after that briefing.
Sarah took a sip of coffee and studied his face. Actually, that's exactly why I wanted to meet with you. I've been hearing some interesting things about what you've been doing since then.
Brennan looked genuinely puzzled. I'm not sure I follow. I've been hearing about your veterans hiring program.
And your volunteer work at the Veterans Center. And the scholarships your company has established for military families. Sarah's expression was unreadable. That's quite a change from the person I met 6 months ago.
Brennan felt his face redden slightly.
I suppose it is. That day in the briefing room was educational for me.
It made me realize how much I didn't know about the people I was criticizing. What specifically changed your mind? Sarah asked. Brennan was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Honestly, it was watching those four generals salute you. I've been in a lot of meetings with high-ranking military officials, and I've never seen anything like that. It made me realize that I had completely missed something important about who you were and what your service meant. He set down his coffee cup and leaned forward slightly. After that briefing, I started reading about your missions, about SEAL training, about what it actually takes to do the things you've done, and I realized that I had been judging people based on completely superficial criteria while being completely ignorant about the reality of their experiences. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. That's a difficult realization to come to. It was, Brennan agreed, but it was necessary. I had built my entire career around believing that business success and political connections were the most important measures of a person's worth. It never occurred to me that there were people out there risking their lives every day to protect the freedoms that allowed me to build that career. He gestured towards the memorial photograph on his desk. I attended a service for a young Marine who was killed in Afghanistan. He was 22 years old, had a wife and a baby daughter. As I sat there listening to his fellow Marines talk about his courage, his dedication, and his sacrifice, I realized that I had never done anything in my life that came close to that level of service. Sarah's expression softened. Mr. Gray. Brennan, I hope you don't think that military service is the only way to serve your country or contribute to society. There are many ways to make a positive difference. I understand that, Brennan replied. But what I didn't understand before was the depth of sacrifice that military service requires, and the respect that such service deserves. When I made those comments about your rank and qualifications, I wasn't just being ignorant about you personally. I was demonstrating a fundamental lack of respect for everyone who has ever put on a uniform.
Sarah set down her coffee cup and leaned back in her chair.
You know, Mr. Brennan, the reason I wanted to meet with you today wasn't to relitigate what happened in that briefing room.
It was to talk about what's happened since then. I'm not sure I understand. I've been doing some research of my own, Sarah said with a slight smile. I've been hearing about your veterans hiring program from some of the people you've employed. I've also heard about your volunteer work from the staff at the Veterans Center. Brennan looked uncomfortable. I hope you don't think I'm doing this to try to make up for what happened. That's not why I started these programs. Actually, Sarah said, that's exactly what I hoped you would say. If you were just doing this out of guilt or to improve your image, it wouldn't mean very much. But the people I've spoken with tell me that your commitment seems genuine, that you're actually learning from these experiences and using that knowledge to help other veterans. She paused before continuing. I wanted to meet with you because I think what you're doing now is more important than what you said 6 months ago. People make mistakes, especially when they're ignorant about things they've never experienced. What matters is whether they learn from those mistakes and try to do better. Brennan felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. Thank you for saying that, Commander. It means more than you know. There's actually another reason I wanted to meet with you, Sarah continued. I'm retiring from the Navy next year, and I'm looking for ways to bridge the gap between military and civilian communities. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding on both sides, and I believe that education and direct interaction are the best ways to address those misunderstandings. She leaned forward with obvious interest. I've been impressed by what your company has accomplished with its veterans programs. I'd like to discuss the possibility of working together to expand those efforts. Brennan's eyes widened. You want to work with my company? I want to work with you, Sarah clarified, but only if you're genuinely committed to this mission. What I have in mind would require a significant investment of time, resources, and credibility. It's not something that can be done halfway or as a public relations gesture. What exactly did you have in mind? Sarah pulled a folder from her briefcase and placed it on the table between them. I'm proposing the creation of a comprehensive program that would provide education, training, and support for both veterans transitioning to civilian careers and civilian employers who want to better understand and utilize military talent. She opened the folder to reveal detailed charts and planning documents. The program would include educational workshops for civilian employers about military culture and the skills that veterans bring to the workplace. It would also provide transition support for veterans, helping them translate their military experience into terms that civilian employers can understand and value. Brennan studied the documents with growing excitement. This is incredibly comprehensive. The scope of what you're proposing would impact thousands of people. That's the idea, Sarah replied. but it would require partners who are committed to the mission rather than just the appearance of supporting veterans. It would also require significant financial investment and long-term commitment.
Brennan looked up from the documents. Commander, I want to be completely honest with you. 6 months ago, I would have looked at this proposal purely in terms of potential profit and public relations benefits. Today, I'm looking at it as an opportunity to actually make a difference in people's lives. He paused, then continued with obvious sincerity. If you're willing to trust me with this partnership, I can promise you that my company will provide whatever resources are necessary to make this program successful. Not because it's good business, although it might be, but because it's the right thing to do. Sarah smiled genuinely. Mr. Brennan, 6 months ago, I thought you were an arrogant civilian who had no understanding of military service or sacrifice. Today, I think you might be exactly the kind of partner this program needs. They spent the next 2 hours discussing details, timelines, and implementation strategies. As their conversation continued, it became clear that both of them had been changed by their initial encounter in ways that neither had fully appreciated at the time. You know, Brennan said as they prepared to leave, I've learned something important from all of this. The most valuable lessons in life often come from the most uncomfortable experiences. Sarah stood and extended her hand. Mr. Brennan, I think this is going to be the beginning of a very productive partnership, and I think it's going to help a lot of people on both sides of the civilian-military divide. As she prepared to leave, Sarah turned back to him with a thoughtful expression. I want you to know that what happened in that briefing room wasn't really about you personally. It was about addressing a broader problem that affects how military personnel are perceived and treated in civilian settings. She paused before adding, the fact that you've taken that experience and used it to create positive change for veterans shows me that you understand the real lesson from that day.
I've taken that time.
It wasn't about punishing you for your ignorance. It was about helping everyone in that room, including you, understand the value of military service and the importance of treating all service members with the respect they've earned. Brennan nodded thoughtfully. I understand that now. And I hope that our work together will help other people avoid making the same mistakes I made. That's exactly what I'm hoping for, Sarah replied. Sometimes the best way to honor military service is to ensure that civilians understand what that service really means. As Sarah left his office, Brennan sat back down and looked again at the memorial photograph on his desk. He thought about the young Marine who had been honored at that service, and about all the other service members who had made similar sacrifices. He thought about the veterans he had met at the center, each with their own story of service and challenge. Most of all, he thought about Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, who had taken what could have been a moment of personal triumph and turned it into an opportunity for education, understanding, and positive change. It was, he realized, exactly the kind of leadership that the military had trained her to provide. The lesson of that day in Conference Room 2B wasn't just about respecting military rank or recognizing combat experience. It was about understanding that true leadership means using your knowledge and expertise to lift others up, to create opportunities for learning and growth, and to build bridges between different communities and perspectives. As Brennan began reviewing the partnership proposal that Sarah had left with him, he smiled at the thought that his greatest professional humiliation had led to what might become his most meaningful contribution. Sometimes, he reflected, the universe has a way of turning our mistakes into opportunities for redemption.